Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another installment of Education Commission of the States Partnering for Success series. We are thrilled to continue to host this webinar series with our partners and state education leaders. I'm Maisha Batiste, Assistant Director of Communications for Education Commission of the States.
And hello, I'm Jeremy Anderson, President of Education Commission of the States, and we are your hosts today. The goal of Partnering for Success is to connect you with peers and resources, providing insights and solutions to some of today's most pressing education policy issues. We hope that today's examples and considerations will leave you inspired and better equipped to address the unique issues happening in your state.
Today, we have two state leaders sharing about their use of data to inform their assessments of the pandemic impact on student learning, as well as their approach to recovery. We'd like to note that today's session will be recorded, so we ask that each of you remain muted. We also encourage you to place your questions in the Q&A chat. And for optimal viewing, please take a moment to change your view settings to speaker view.
Before we invite Commissioner Vandeven and Senator Ballard to begin, I want to take a moment to thank all of our partners for their collaboration and support in this work. We are pleased to be able to partner with SAS for today's presentation and are grateful to all of our partners who provide year-long support to Education Commission of the States. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Senator Deanna Ballard from North Carolina, who chairs the Senate Education and the Appropriations and Policy Committees, and Dr. Margie Vandeven, Commissioner of Education for the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and Dr. Vandeven also serves as our National Treasurer for the Education Commission of the States. Lastly, I'm elated to introduce Katrina Miller, who serves as the SAS Director of Educational Partnerships and will be leading our conversation today. Katrina, the virtual podium is all yours.
Thank you, Jeremy and ECS team. We're so excited to be here today to really learn from Missouri and North Carolina about how they're assessing learning loss so that local entities, districts, and schools can address it at the local level. We've worked with both North Carolina and Missouri over the past year, as well as many other states, and really using data and analytics to understand learning loss. When you think about learning loss, there are a ton of news stories around it. It feels like when this pandemic started, there were all these crazy predictions about how much learning would be lost over the next year. And we all know as educators that learning wasn't really lost. Students still continue to learn in different ways, but they did have a loss of instructional opportunity. And we need to understand that within the education community so that we can help students recover and accelerate learning going into the future. So we're going to try to do this in a few ways. But what's really important is the benefits that we get from this. First, we want to identify which groups experienced more learning loss than others. We know the experience of the pandemic was not the same for all students. It wasn't the same for all states, districts, or schools. So understanding how the pandemic impacted students differently and localities differently is really important. We also want to identify differences in patterns of learning across different grades and subjects. We know middle grades math is pretty hard, and parents may not have been as able to help and assist students while they were learning from home. And we saw that play out in the data, and we'll show that a bit later. We also want to understand those different learning environments. Did we see as much learning loss for schools that stayed open? Was there a differential impact on those schools who remained remote for the majority of not only 2020, in spring 2020, but also 2021? And then finally, we want to identify those exemplars. Which schools really mitigated learning loss and their students continued to grow and excel during the pandemic? What can we learn from them? And how do we use the lessons that they've learned to move forward and accelerate student learning? The way that we do this is to really take a broad approach to data using a complex model to understand the expectation for students. First, we use data from 2017-18, 18-19 to establish a student's expected performance based on the average schooling experience had the pandemic not happened. So based on a student's previous data, if the pandemic hadn't happened, how would we have expected them to perform in 2021? We then compare their actual results on statewide assessments in 2021 to that pre-pandemic expectation, and we aggregate those differences. And this is a visualization of what that may look like. If you have a student who in 2018 was in the 4th grade and they took a reading and math exam, in 2019 they would have been in 5th grade and they may have had a reading, math, and science score. We take all of those scores and make a projection to 2021 when they would have been in the 7th grade. And that's that white dot there. That's what their expected performance would have been had the pandemic not happened. We then compare that to their actual performance in reading and math in 2021. And that gap is what we see as the observed impact of the pandemic on reading and math. And this is exactly what we did in Missouri and North Carolina, and they're going to share a little bit of their results. So what have we learned? Across 10 states now, we've learned that we did have larger impacts in math than in reading and ELA. And we saw quite a variation across different assessments and across states. We have some states that experienced quite dramatic learning loss, others that really didn't. They saw students make appropriate gains during the pandemic. We also saw that some student groups were more impacted than others. For instance, students of color and low-income students may have had more impact with learning loss than their peers. We saw considerable variation across schools and districts. So even within a state that had very similar statewide policies, our districts and our schools implemented their resources very differently and saw differences. And finally, we saw a lot of exemplars, even exceeding the pre-pandemic expectations. And that's where we're most excited to learn from both Missouri and North Carolina to understand how they're using this data to move forward. So I want to go into some questions now with our guests so they can share their perspective on really what happened during the pandemic. And we'll start with Senator Ballard. Senator Ballard, you were instrumental early on in the pandemic in passing legislation focused on understanding the impact of the pandemic on student learning using data. Why was this something that you focused on in 2020?
There we go. Sorry, I'm a little frozen over here. My screen was. It's a pleasure to be with each and every one of you today, and I am eager to share kind of what took place in North Carolina and how we continue to really ride out of the pandemic and really build successful students. So I'll give you a little background real quick. In March of 2020, that's when our governor decided that we were going to shut down our schools, and we got on a call that weekend. I remember it was like March 15th. And he had made the decision. And so immediately, it hadn't been announced yet, but immediately we go into this mode of, okay, what's next? What are we going to do? And then we knew we were going into full remote learning. And that's not something we did. We had done a lot of, I would say. I mean, in some schools have, but they hadn't. So it's, the impact at the local level is what was, they're in the present moment, they're having to pivot. They're the ones having to, do the work in the moment. So I go into a mode where I know the feds are actually trying to figure out what to do. And at the state level, I'm trying to think through, okay, how can we be looking forward? Let's keep thinking forward, keep thinking ahead, and just understanding how this unfinished learning was really going to impact long-term success for our students. So for me, it really became all of our practitioners are so busy in the moment, really taking care of the districts and addressing it so immediately. So I'm in a mode of, okay, how are we going to assess this statewide in order to really help folks moving forward, how to address it locally and kind of in the impact. So I think we're still grappling with some of that, the veracity of which kind of things changed for us in the moment. And then just the virus and its unpredictability as we moved forward in 2020. But as the federal dollars came in, it was one of the first things I did. And knowing that we have SAS in our own backyard, we were able to just kind of know what questions we want to ask, what answers we want to get to. And I mean, it was just money. I actually, appropriated dollars towards this effort in one of the first set of, I think, CARES funding that we had. So it was a really intentional and I would say just kind of forward thinking attitude. While I know so many people were in the moment and the present, I was trying to go ahead and be thinking about what are our next steps? What are we going to do? Because we know we're going to have some impact here, a negative impact. So, I mean, that's a little bit of background.
Thank you. And Commissioner Vandeven, you took a bit of a different approach. You already had spring 2021 assessment back, and then you chose to move forward with evaluating the impact of the pandemic in a more robust way with that data. What prompted your decision?
Yeah, thank you, Katrina, and thank you all for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to be here with everyone. I don't know about any of you, but when Senator Ballard was talking about March of 2020, it just made me shudder a little bit, just reminiscing of those craziest of times. And I'll just tell you that, Missouri, we were one of the first states to cancel our spring 2020 assessments, really understanding that there was, in the end, it didn't matter because most schools were closed that spring. But at the early stages, teachers were saying, take something off our plates. And we said we need to do that. And we responded quickly. But the following year, when the question remained, we were getting lots of questions. Are you going to assess? It was very clear that we felt they're using the same logic that we did in March of 2020. There is a time and a place for assessment, statewide assessment. March 2020, not so much. Spring of 2021, absolutely. Our state board was very much so in support of trying to understand where we were. The governor was really clear that he would like to see some assessment results and what happened. The SEA, we were on board with wanting to administer those tests for the information that we wanted to garner. And again, context, Missouri is a local control state. So we had school districts doing very different things throughout 2021 school year in terms of keeping their doors open. And we really wanted to understand impact. Where are we? We heard a lot about learning loss. Where are we as a state, and what do we need to do? So we got those proficiency rates back, and they were helpful. Certainly did identify some of what we thought we might see. As you mentioned, we did see steeper declines in the earlier levels, steeper declines in math, those types of issues, but it didn't really answer a number of the questions that we really wanted answered. And so that's why we wanted to take a more robust approach. What we really wanted to know, so the proficiency rates were important, but just insufficient. What we really wanted to know was, did we need to keep our school doors open? Was that more beneficial? The questions that we have on every single one of our federal relief dollar applications talks about who was most significantly impacted. We needed to answer that question. So which groups were significantly impacted? Was that geography? Was that demographics? Was that students that were in school full-time, students that were remote, students that were hybrid? So wanted to take a much deeper look at how the impact played out. And then, probably as importantly, how do we respond now? How do we most effectively use the relief dollars that we have to intervene in those most essential places so that we see the most efficient and effective use of those funds to help our students?
If I may piggyback too on that for just a minute. I mean, when we think about March 2020, we were already 3/4 way through our school year. So we were itching for whatever data we had up until that point. Like we were just trying to make sure it was just accurate, and because we knew that was going to be kind of like the cliff a little bit, like we're not going to have anything else the rest of the year. So let's be rich in the information that we have, figure out how we can set that up so that when we go back in the fall of 2020, then we know how to kind of cover, make up for, get some new footing from the summer. But then of course, it just continued on through the year. So there were a lot of questions, as Margie mentioned, just about assessments and what to really take to heart and what are we doing. Our district's going to be penalized. And so we had to go through about 65 to 75 statutes one by one to figure out kind of what assessments, what direction we were going to give districts and our agencies to know, here's what we need, here's what we're going to look for, let's think about this, so that we kind of, or waive a lot of waivers, just like feds were even doing too. So I would say that was also part of just piggybacking on the importance of, should something like this happen again, I mean, let's all be mindful and intentional about utilizing anything you have to date. And so we were really trying to make sure that we had the best info on that too. So.
Thank you both for your perspective of kind of like your decision making in that moment of why you needed this data and what benefit you thought it would bring. So both of you have the data now. You have it in your hands. You've seen it. You've had a little bit of time to grapple with it. What has your state learned about the impact of the pandemic on student learning? Senator, do you want to start?
Sure. I think, it's disappointing. It's kind of disheartening a little bit to see it once you see it on paper, what happened and kind of what groups, when you aggregate the data, into just the different aspects, whether it's, subject and grade and demographics, your economically disadvantaged and eligibility for free or reduced lunch. When you start to kind of drill down on that, you really see, if you've been in the education space, your instincts were probably pretty spot on, but to actually see it on paper really, taught us a lot. And it helps us tell the story of what really happened during the pandemic. So in North Carolina, in general, I would say that all student groups and grades and subjects really did see like a learning loss. Math was more impacted than English. Even our academic and intellectually gifted kids saw more learning loss than expected. But it was interesting to see that surprisingly, kind of our special ed and military connected and English language learners saw less learning loss than expected. And I think if you think about it, that's because a lot of those services and those wraparound services that those students receive remained consistent, even with some of the 6 feet social distancing or some of those metrics that were involved, because they worked in smaller classrooms anyway, or had just extra attention and care, intentional effort in their space as well. So I think those were just some of the highlights of really the data that that we saw, and it really did reflect kind of what schools offered, really the hybrid or the remote learning fully entirely, or who was really back in the kind of pushed the envelope and just went back into the classroom. So we were able to kind of look at that through that lens as well.
Commissioner, what about your state?
Yeah, I think what we found was somewhat similar, and also, as the senator mentioned, disheartening, of course, but instructional mode is the area where we wanted to focus on, and we did have a number of schools who went back immediately. They started the school year in person for a number of reasons, and then we also had school districts who did not go back almost the entire school year. But for the most part, we had a mixture, more students in seat than in a fully remote situation. So that's some context. But our data are clear that instructional mode mattered in this situation, no doubt about it. And the students who had opportunity to go in person and school doors were open seemed to fare much better. So I think that was an important piece of information that we did want to review in the data. It is helpful moving forward, and it's helpful also in understanding what we need to do to go forward. The part that was probably the most disheartening was that it gave us an even clearer picture about the gap widening. We've spent over a decade just really focusing on closing that achievement gap, and now this disruption occurs, and what we see in our state is that gap has indeed increased. And so again, what we do with that is important, and how we respond to that is really important. And so what we're looking at, maybe does chronological aging grouping still work in our state? I mean, we're really digging in on how do we respond and think about what we know. It's not just that in some cases a student loss, if you can quantify using a more robust data system on really how much loss, some kids did very well. I mean, so that's the thing, that we don't want to hold those students back who did very well and make assumptions that everyone lost multiple years of learning. That is not the case. Some kids did very well, but the reality is some students have a lot of catching up to do. And so a lot of work to be done. And I think the data is a good roadmap for us in looking at that.
Commissioner, you teed up the next question perfectly, and it goes to both of you as well, but we'll start with you. How are you using this data moving forward? You mentioned thinking about grade bands and age-based grade bands, but what else are you using it for? And what are your next steps in understanding the impact of the pandemic and then moving forward to support students?
Well, I think how we're using it right now, again, is to drive some policy decision-making and decision-making about how we're investing moving forward with the relief dollars when you need to answer that question, who was most significantly impacted. We're using the information to think about the future and if this should occur again, that we'll have some information on things like instructional mode. But what I want to say is that, you know, tests have been completed for 2022. What I would like to do is to look at where we are in comparison to the prior year. So you keep building on that. And these interventions that we're putting, you know, a lot of energy right now on teaching reading. So our literacy efforts, done a lot of work with early learning. We've done a lot of intervention. And what we want to be able to do is continue to invest in those areas that are working, continuing to monitor the data and see where the impact is most significant. So I'm looking forward to continuing to build on the data that we put into place. The senator said something that was really important earlier, and that is knowing what questions you want answered ahead of collecting the data, which is a challenge when you're in the middle of a pandemic. But I think we got part of it right in saying things like we wanted to know about instructional mode. But a couple of things we missed might have been, could we attach that to student attendance? And even if school doors were open, was that individual child attending class? Because we are seeing some patterns in the data by demographic that do not necessarily correlate to the instructional delivery mode. So just, it's like the onion layer that we talk about. You just keep peeling back and you have more and more questions that you want to answer. And so we're using it in a number of ways.
Senator?
Wow. I would agree with a lot of what Margie has just said too, because I think those are some of the same areas, you know, with all the federal dollars that were coming in at the same time and various ESSER rounds, we kind of knew what areas we wanted to, you know, target and put interest in. So, I mean, we have been using some of these federal dollars to put in over $300 million in literacy and the science of reading here in North Carolina. So, I mean, this is one area in which this data has done nothing but continue to support and affirm that how important and critical that early childhood literacy is. And so the data, you know, even we didn't have everything compiled at this point either, but we're just kind of trusting a little bit what we were seeing happening on the ground, even working with some of our higher ed campuses, and they were tracking various things. You know, we're fortunate here in North Carolina to have like NC State and, you know, Carolina and UNC Charlotte that are able to really help, and even some research ahead of time too, because, you know, we knew the achievement gap was going to be we knew it was big, you know, wide already. We've known that, but how much wider was it going to go? So I would say that. I would also say connectivity. I think that's something that though our study and data really finds that students made a lot of progress with in-person instruction, we also, as Margie mentioned, we see students that really thrived in kind of the virtual academy setting. So one thing we've been doing is really offering a little bit more opportunity for our districts to develop a framework around virtual academies. We had some schools were doing it, I guess, but we had no record of it. We had no way of assessing or accountability measures in that space to a degree to understand kind of what the pattern of, you know, results and outcomes might look like. So we created a bit more. We're still in the process of creating a framework for that space because some districts loved it. Like they loved having really a virtual academy option in addition to kind of the in-classroom. But, you know, we're trying to make it where you have one option or the other and not really fall into the hybrid mode, because that gets really complicated and really complex, I think, for families and such too. So that's one area. And then, you know, I mean, yeah, focusing on our higher needs, the connectivity, and that the majority of the students really do thrive in kind of the in-person instruction. And what can we do then to continue to support that? It's funny Margie mentioned attendance, because that was actually a big point of attention, I think, early on too, because we were really trying to drive home, you know, where are the kids? Like, so where, I mean, you know, you've got some, what we would call our missing students out there, and they weren't showing up online, or they either weren't coming back into the school for whatever reason, family reasons, but it really drove home this notion of, okay, what does attendance look like in this space versus this space? What are we counting exactly? And then what does funding look like in a virtual academy model versus perhaps in a brick and mortar model? So it really, and then how many students are participating regularly. So it got into this whole big conversation. So I think those are just really some targeted areas that we have started to look at moving forward too, and just eager to see that, I mean, there's going to be progress, but I think everyone needs to recognize it's going to be at a slower pace than I think even like pre-pandemic. So I think we just kind of need to keep that in mind too.
Thank you for that. There's a lot of confounding factors that go into all of this, looking at the data and then understanding what is impacting learning. So I love that you both brought all of those nuances to the conversation. And both of you sit in very different places. Commissioner, you had an agency and kind of oversee the schools. Senator, you're of course in that policy and legislative making body. What advice would you have for your peers, knowing what you know now and how you have approached this? What advice would you have for them on how to tackle this type of issue?
Would you like to start with me? Geez, I think it goes back to what I was saying even originally. I mean, really thinking ahead. If you use data, like really, I mean, like Margie, think about what questions, be really critical in your thinking skills and with the right stakeholders at the table to think through what questions you're really wanting to kind of get the answers to. I think that's really, really critical and just important to have and surround yourself with the right people at the table to be able to get there to do that. I think then what you have to do, and I would say my colleagues, if you serve in the legislature or even at the agency level and in the districts, I mean, we got to trust the data. Lots of times there's some inaccurate information, inaccurate data out there. So I think we really need to be mindful of just being confident in what we're receiving, what we're seeing, what we're getting, and then being able to really be strategic in how we walk that out and how we apply that data moving forward too. So I think you have to be, in terms of decision making, which is kind of what I was really running into. I wasn't having to be like boots on the ground in a district and ensuring, we've got the mobile hotspots that we need, but really at my space, having to think outside the box. And I think education is more poised than ever, especially in North Carolina. The culture of education is more poised than ever to really just change and transform. And so I was really also a bit early on in the 2020 and the pandemic, trying to push that home, because I was trying to keep everybody moving forward and not just sort of camp out in this space of oh my gosh, uncertainty. Don't be paralyzed by the fear of just not knowing what's going on or what's coming next, but use this as an opportunity, really. So I fostered that within my membership here in the General Assembly, and then also with our state boards and our leadership at the various agencies. So I feel if you can kind of shape the culture and create the culture and then get your policy work to kind of complement those efforts, and then the funding and the resources necessary, I mean, I really think you can lift up the local work that's being done in the ground, and that's where the most, the critical impact is. So I think those are just a few things.
Those are all great things, Senator. And I know people in North Carolina really do appreciate your leadership in that area, because, I would only add one. I was going to also say, the right question. I think the only other piece I would add to that is your definitions. It's so tedious, but they're so important, and it's like, when you say hybrid, what do you mean by hybrid? When you say on-site, what do you mean by on-site? And just trying to get to that part as clearly as possible. But getting back to what the Senator was just talking about, what you heard in her voice there, and what I hope we're communicating here, is to use the data to stay very solution oriented to help our students. And the only hesitation that I heard from my school leaders across the state or another is like, well, what are you going to do with the data? What are you going to do with the data? Well, what we're going to do with the data is work really hard to usher our way through a global pandemic so that we can serve our children the very best that we can. But there is we've sort of been conditioned into some of the accountability pieces with standardized testing and I'm a firm believer in accountability, so I'm not going down another path here. But in this case today, what are we doing with the data? We're trying to find the proper roadmap to help get our kids back on track the very best that we can. And if we can all stay solution oriented and not, Monday morning quarterbacking or who made what decisions, I think that will serve us better as a nation.
Thank you both so much. Those were great pieces of advice, and I love the passion both of you have and the focus on really helping students and helping educators help students. We don't see that everywhere, so I love that. And I just want to let the audience know that all three of us, I think Senator Ballard, you're going to be there as well. Margie, I know you will be at the ECS conference and be available to talk. If you have other questions, I know we're going to have a Q&A here as well. But we're working, in addition to Missouri and North Carolina, with 8 other states on this type of work, and we'll be releasing information about that soon, about their findings. And like I mentioned earlier, it varies widely. So I think this is an opportunity where we can come together as an education community and learn from each other. What we did differently during the pandemic, what we're doing differently now, and really replicate those best practices across state lines and across district lines. Because we're kind of all in the same boat at this point with the impact of the pandemic. I've heard the kind of story about we're all in the same storm, but we have different sized boats and different resources to kind of get out of that. But if we can share those resources and the learning across all of those different lines, I think that we can support students in a greater way. So I really appreciate both of you for your passion and your dedication to kids and for your time today. And I'll turn it back over to the ECS team for Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Katrina, and it's great to have your representation with SAS. And thank you, Commissioner Vandeven and Senator Ballard. So a couple of the comments you made, you talked about attendance and the importance of that. And we know nationally we've had about a 3% drop in K-12 enrollment across the country. And I think there's a lot of questions that people still have on, what about the summer learning loss that we were working on before the pandemic, and that problem's probably been amplified a little bit. Do you have any information on how best the data and analytics can account for the known summer learning loss and kind of help with that as we try to grow out of the pandemic?
Margie, I'll let you go first.
Okay, very good. Well, what we're seeing an increase in our attendance for summer school. I haven't been able to monitor yet if they're actually attending or not. So I can't give you that information yet, but we are monitoring that. When I was talking about not having the attendance data connected directly to, and we will be able to go back and dig into it, but finding out if school doors were open, if some students still opted to stay home instead of attending school, if that impacted the amount of learning loss that may have occurred. But what I think we need, I'm hearing this from educators all across the state, is the concern about building that expectation that students need to be back in school every day, unless they're sick, of course, because we've seen declines just in not students disappearing, but just students who are not coming to school on a regular daily basis. And that, I think, is part of the impact of the pandemic and across all of society, that people are just, the attendance is a little bit off in work and in schools, and how do we get some of that part back? And we know students need to be present to learn. So somewhere, even if it's virtual, they need to be present to learn. And so I think it's an important thing to continue to monitor and to continue to share with our communities how important it is and the role that they can play in elevating a definitely return to learn.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of add to that, in regards to summer particularly, the summer of 2020, things were still so chaotic. I mean, we were trying to do sort of a jumpstart program prior to school starting, kind of lackluster. I mean, our restrictions were kind of even tightening up then. So we really didn't get to do as much as we had wanted. And then we go into a year where it's just back and forth and kind of crazy schedules and scenarios. And then this past summer, a year ago, as the first summer, we actually required each district to offer a summer programming, and an effort to really gain some footing and gain some ground perhaps. And that was across all, like, elementary and even high school. And that was something our House members had really been our Speaker of the House was really trying to drive home and figure out. And it's the first time we'd ever done anything like that. And I think there's still some mixed feelings and results kind of coming out of that as far as the required offerings. Now our districts have an option, and we had a specific framework and specific subjects that we really needed to ensure and So it depends on the districts now, like this summer, kind of went back into their usual sort of mode of being able to kind of come up with the timing and the schedule and offerings themselves too. So we'll kind of be able to see, even maybe compare that a little later to see what was most effective. I find it really interesting. I'm not sure, the summer slide, as everyone also calls it too. I think for me, it's even hard to sort of, separate it all now, because to me it all just runs together, and I just consider it all a bit of just a scenario of a 2-year pandemic kind of learning loss space too. But I think parents, after that year of craziness, I do think last summer when we were requiring it, parents were just frustrated because our kids have just been jerked around a little bit back and forth. We need a break. We need we need time as a family too. But we were just so eager. I think our house members were just so eager to really get folks back into a routine of sorts. So we'll kind of see moving forward, I think, kind of what the summer analysis portion might look like.
And Jeremy, I can answer that from a perspective from a few other states as well we're looking at. So a lot of states are implementing summer school using COVID dollars or high dosage tutoring during the summer. And they're using what we call student projections, which is basically looking at where students are now and have been in the past, and then projecting to their likelihood of performance in the future to identify students who may need those extra supports, and then providing those interventions during the summer. And we are actually working with several states where we're evaluating those summer programs to see, did it have an impact on student learning? Is it actually increasing their trajectory and helping them grow at a faster rate than expected compared to other students like them who aren't getting that type of work? So we're hopefully in the next year, data lags. You have to let them go through the intervention and then kind of evaluate the intervention. But we have some of that data from the summer of 21. And of course, we'll continue to monitor that in 22. And we're hoping that the states that are getting that information will begin to share that. Specifically around, we know that all summer programs aren't created equal. So what programs are actually having the largest impact on all students and then on specific student groups?
Thank you all for your responses. I have the next question. In higher education, we are experimenting with more competency-based models. I wonder if these data or others could be informative toward those types of initiatives. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts on this if we could. I think it's just something we really do need to look at. We will be bringing this to our board on Tuesday, not necessarily in connection with higher education, but I am happy to hear that they are looking at that approach as well. Right now, we pay on seat time, and we do a lot based on seat time. And as I'm mentioning, I had a school district talk about being multiple grade levels behind, and we also have students who are thriving at the same grade level. So what do? That just doesn't seem to fit our model anymore. I just think we have to look at things a little bit differently. And right now seems to be the appropriate time to do that.
I would agree with Margie. We are looking, we've been looking at that over the last year, using, dollars as well, federal dollars, to be able to kind of tackle that space a little bit. And I think the key to, it's a heavy lift to do that. And again, a shift in thinking amongst educators and even legislators as well. So it's not an easy, it's not an easy hill to climb. But you also just need the right leadership in the right places to be able to get it done, I think. So we're in the same boat. We're trying to figure it out.
So one of the questions, we got a couple that have come in more around well-rounded education. So was art instruction part of the data collections in your state? And I think broader in regards to the non-tested subjects like arts, music education in many states. What are your ideas around policies that might address some of the learning loss in those areas to continue a well-rounded education?
Well, in North Carolina, one thing we did last year was actually we made a graduation requirement for arts, like arts education. So we just know that interaction and that level of just, folks, parents were asking for it. I mean, you've got some legislators on the House side that were really wanting to get it done. I know the last thing we all want sometimes is another requirement, graduation requirement, but that was one thing we've done in that space. And I would defer to Katrina maybe on some of the data collection part of it and analysis and what, if arts in particular or any of that side was really factored in as well to what she's seen.
Yeah, so we specifically in this type of analysis, we are doing tested subjects, and that can include other subjects. Like in North Carolina, for instance, they do a lot of career and technical education where they have state developed tests that we're able to use in our modeling, but we haven't been able to assess things that aren't in a traditional assessment. But definitely agree that, you know, it's an important part of the schooling experience and really creating a well-rounded education.
And I'll probably just add that in Missouri, what we're looking at is we're redesigning our accreditation system, or we've redesigned it. And part of what we're adding to that is looking at those tested areas. And really that's what we can do for the data that we have at the state level, is to use those tested areas. But in our Missouri School Improvement Program, we have also broadened it so that we have an expectation for course offerings, and we're putting together reports that show who has access to these various courses and course taking patterns. And I think that is going to be very powerful information. We've shifted from making it 100% on outcome to 70% on outcome, 30% on input, and allowing districts to pull together their comprehensive school improvement plans for their own development. And I think what we will see in those areas is absolutely the important. I mean, people who want to teach math talk about how you're able to get that spatial development through your art class. I mean, we don't want to see a removal of those other essential elements that really help our children grow and find their real passion in education. I mean, you see some of these students in various courses that just engage them in the learning process, and they're learning math and they're reading in the content area, and they don't even know that they're doing those things because they're so excited about what they're doing. So sure don't want to turn away from that, but the data that we specifically have on this area is more around the tested areas.
I have the next question. It's coming from Michelle Jewell. Jewel says, I know one of the speakers mentioned that many of the English language learners fared pretty equally prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic. Did internet connectivity affect this? And Jewel just states that Senator Ballard just mentioned the virtual academies. So there's a connection there.
Katrina, if you would like to speak to some of that too, from the SAS standpoint in our study. I mean, we have a lot of data. You have a lot of raw data that you receive when you do a lot of this. So she's much more familiar with it sometimes than I am in the bigger pictures.
So that's one of the questions that's like a next step question. We've illuminated that this was a pattern. We saw that they kind of were closer to that pre-pandemic expectation than we expected them to be. And like Senator Ballard mentioned earlier, as we talked to the team at the Department of Public Instruction, they noted, you know, they got support services immediately in March 2020. They were getting support services throughout the summer and immediately in the fall of 2020. So while other students may have not been having that interface with the school, special education students and English language learners kept that interface throughout the pandemic. They also were prioritized in North Carolina as some of the first to come back to in-person instruction. So for those districts or schools that did like staggered re-enrollment, essentially, where they brought kids back and then they still had some that were remote, they prioritized special education students. So anecdotally, that's what we think was playing into that. I haven't heard anything about internet connectivity being a part of that or contributing to that, but that's one of those things that as the Department of Public Instruction got their results back, they started kind of digging into a little bit more to understand what actually caused this result, so that then we can understand, was it the in-person instruction so quickly? Was it those high-touch support services that special education students tend to get? And do we need to do more high-touch for those students who were disproportionately impacted from the pandemic? And it's kind of bringing those questions to the surface.
So the next question we have, and we probably got two more here. One is about just the real or perceived lack of accountability for some statewide virtual schools, kind of pre-pandemic and then into the pandemic. And what are your state plans doing to tighten accountability and maybe even enforce consequences where necessary for schools that do not meet the minimum state standards?
Well, I can try to jump in on that. You know, I want to be clear that I'm not sure that it's really fair to judge all virtual education based upon the results that we got back from the pandemic, because in many cases, you know, it's going to look vastly different when teachers are trained to deliver virtual education, when they have the equipment. I mean, we were just pretty much thrown into this, and the connectivity and the devices and the training and all of that comes with it. However, I will say that I do think there is great room for improvement in doing exactly what whoever asked that question is sort of referencing, that if we are going to be treating and telling parents that these are schools that can educate their children, we need to have an equal playing field and help them understand and see some results for what is happening in those virtual platforms. So we are working now, we have a MOCAP program where virtual providers can come in, and we're working on putting together report cards that look similar and do report on those data for the students who come in to our virtual platforms, and being able to provide that information to parents, because we do think it's really important.
Last question we'll probably take here before we close out, but I think one that's a little bit broader on some of the policy side. If you think back 5-10 years ago, when we started to see at ECS a lot of states putting money into early learning programs across their states, what happened soon after was a need for states saying we need a governance kind of body to look at early learning across multiple agencies. And just like the data usage through this pandemic has really grown a lot in state policy, but also in the way you're using them. Senator Ballard, you talked about just the large amounts of raw data that you're trying to work through. So do you have any ideas about data governance, or do you see that as an issue within your own state, whether that's with the state education agency and local districts, or whether that's even state agencies working with each other?
There's a lot going on in the data space in North Carolina. For folks who aren't aware, we have identified an attainment goal for our state so that we would have reach 2 million, credentials or degrees, associate degrees, bachelor's by 2030. So we are working towards even what we call longitudinal data system. That's been a slow process for us, really. But one thing that I think the pandemic and just kind of even the data collection and evaluation is really revealing to us is really the interoperability of the data between agencies and even at the local level, and getting community colleges and your K-12 space to understand it's okay to share data, especially in this area and this environment, this time period. But there's a lot of work, I would say, that we are looking at, even some more funding in terms of even being able to develop the right stakeholders in a working group to establish how this looks, what this looks like. It's not necessarily like the longitudinal with the student. It's a little different in that it's more horizontal across agencies, or even at a local level, getting those folks to understand that collaborative information data can work for everyone. You don't have to hold on to it. And if we really want to be keeping the success of students and our school communities in mind, I just really think it's important for all our players and leadership to come together in that space. And one last thing I would say is, I was thinking about this earlier, but I would encourage those that are listening, just don't be afraid of data. I mean, no matter what it looks like, just don't be afraid of it. It's important. It's critical to share the story of what's really going on, what's happening. Whether it's a child's data to the parent, to the family, whether it's the school, to the state. I mean, don't be afraid of telling the story of what data is really revealing, and be ready. I mean, it just helps you to learn and to know exactly how I need to be strategic and targeted, and what policy work I need to do, where we need to lift up other portions too, and statute, or what's no longer working. I mean, half the time that's the battle too, is understanding, well, what's not working, let's get rid of it, let's move on. But as Margie had mentioned earlier, just being really solution minded and not be fearful of what data might reveal.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If I'll just chime in real quickly too. I think anybody that's tuning into a webinar that's titled what this is titled will not make too much fun of me when I say this question really excites me. It gets me very, very excited because it is so necessary. And even during the pandemic, Governor Parson in Missouri launched the Office of Childhood and merged the Department of elements of it, not all of the offices, obviously, but parts of social services and of the Department of Health and Senior Services with the Department of Education. So that's now all housed within our agency. And one of the biggest components that we're working on right now is to pull all those data sets together so that we are much better informed. And it's not a simple task. It sounds so simple to do that. Thank you.
Agree,
Thank you
Margie.
for that.
It is.
Yes, and so but it's exciting, and there's so much. We are investing some of our set aside funds into longitudinal data system across K-12 as well. So I think there's great opportunity ahead, and thank you for that question.
I would say one thing we did too, as well, is, I mean, with the money I was talking about with our early literacy and science of reading, pre-K sits over in HHS. So one thing we did do was actually build a bridge in an office that is specific to literacy that has not been developed before, that where we forced HHS in that pre-K space a bit more to it fall in line with the science of reading and how we're really providing and instructing our educators at that level, and then on through into the K-12 space. So we've been trying to make some progress there as well, Margie, and really kind of aligning some of those efforts across agencies. But as she mentioned, it is not easy. And it sounds easy, but it's not.
Well, thanks everyone today for the great questions from our audience and for your participation. We really appreciate each of you joining us, and please join me in a huge applause for our presenters, Katrina Miller from SAS, Commissioner Vandeven from Missouri, and Senator Ballard from North Carolina. It was truly a great privilege to be able to feature each of you today.
Education Commission of the States is here to support you in your work. We value your feedback and would greatly appreciate it if you would please take a couple minutes while the experience is fresh to share your thoughts and opinions on today's event. A link will be provided when we adjourn. Today's session was recorded and will be shared in your post-event email.
Our virtual series will return after our in-person National Forum on Education Policy, taking place July 13th through 15th in Washington, D.C. We've placed a link in the chat to share the event details, and registration is still open for those of you who can join us. If you have some additional questions or would like to network, I hope you will reach out to me or any of our staff at ECS, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at our National Forum on Education Policy. Thanks again for joining us today.